You're listening to the Decisive podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision making. Welcome to the Decisive podcast brought to you by S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm your host, Kristen Hallam. In this episode, we're discussing the outlook for the Russia-Ukraine war as we approach the anniversary of the conflict. We'll also talk about President Donald Trump's approach to NATO, which expanded after the Ukraine war. And to do that, we have two special guests, Blanka Calnan, our head of European country risk, and John Rains, our head of North America country risk. Blanka, welcome to the Decisive, and John, welcome back. It's great to have you both here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Blanka, let's start with you. Can we take a quick stock of where we are with the Russia-Ukraine war at the moment? And is there anything that has changed that has had an impact on the course of the war?
Yes, sure. There has been intensive fighting, and both sides, both Russia and Ukraine, have suffered heavy casualties, both in personal and in equipment. But the land battle remains a strategic stalemate. Russia has made some further advances on the wide front in eastern Ukraine, but it lacks the spare capacity to break through Ukrainian defenses. They have also stepped up their air campaign against Ukrainian energy infrastructure and population centers. And in the last quarter of last year, we have seen some of the most intense UAV and missile attacks against Ukraine since the start of the war in February 2022. This obviously puts Ukraine under severe strain. They have done limited incursion into Russia's Kursk region, which began in August last year. They have committed some of the best formations there, but this has so far failed to give Ukraine the initiative or ease the pressure of Russian offensive operations in eastern Ukraine. Western authorization that we saw in November for Ukraine to engage military targets inside Russia with long range missiles that the United States and the United Kingdom have supplied will probably take some pressure off Ukrainian forces, especially in the Kursk region. But it is not our assessment that this event alone will change the course of the war decisively in Ukraine's favor.
All right, thank you for that, Blanka. Now, what does this mean for our outlook? What's our current 12-month outlook for the Russia-Ukraine war, Blanka?
We are currently in quite uncertain period. The re-election of Donald Trump as US president is probably the single development with the greatest potential to change the course of the war, either as an indirect consequence of the reduction or withdrawal of US political and military support, or through Trump's declared intention to act as a mediator. The president has previously advocated cessation of US aid to Ukraine, and indeed, the US was the single largest supplier of military aid to Ukraine between 2022-24. And there is still a lot of uncertainty over US administration's position, and we are still waiting for more concrete policy announcements. But for now, we maintain our view that in the coming months, the conflict will remain a stalemate. And what do I mean by that? Both sides recognize that neither has the military capability or current resources to achieve a definitive victory. But at the same time, there are indications that both sides recognize that the war is becoming politically unsustainable. And this scenario entails a likely ceasefire agreement that would fix current lines of contact as a de facto boundary, but there would be daily violations by both sides, but in our assessment, with no strategically significant shift in territorial control.
Blanka, in our recent outlook, we've also increased the likelihood of Russian victory. And I'd like you to define what that means, victory. But what were the key factors in making that assessment?
So let me first define what we mean by Russian victory, like I did with the stalemate. It is ending the war on terms that are more favorable to Russia than to Ukraine. And under this scenario, Russia is unlikely to achieve all of its war objectives, such as regime change in Kiev or the annexation of whole eastern Ukraine, or the control of the Black Sea coast. But They would be likely to capture all of the southern and eastern regions under this scenario. The negotiated settlement would include a new line of contact on the front line between Russian and Ukrainian forces. And Ukraine would be probably forced to cede its aspirations to join NATO, at least in the foreseeable future. And the impact would go beyond Ukraine. If Russia is emboldened by its success in Ukraine, they would be likely to direct Russian ground forces to explore the capture of Odessa and deploy troops in Moldova. And this was ostensibly to protect ethnic Russians living there and what they would call the supporting the separatist administration and Transnistria, but at the same time blocking Moldova's aspiration to join the EU. So the consequences would go beyond, well beyond Ukraine, and it would touch upon much wider Europe. This is not a baseline scenario. However, the uncertainty over the US administration's position, at least currently, on the conflict was the primary reason for this change and for a slight increase of the likelihood of what we call Russian victory.
All right. Well, John, sounds like a good time to bring you into the conversation. What has President Trump said on the campaign trail about Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think what you heard when he was on the campaign trail was that he had some type of secret plan that he would not divulge, and that this would end up resulting in some type of resolution of the conflict in about 24 hours. Since he's been in office now for 3 or 4 days, we have not heard anything. But I think the real thing on the campaign trail that we heard over and over again was that he was quite neutral in his approach to both Russia and Ukraine. For example, in one of the debates, he was asked, "Who do you want to win this war, Russia or Ukraine?" And obviously, under the Biden administration, it was clear the United States wanted Ukraine. He refused to answer that question. And on top of that, he refused to answer a question as to whether he had spoken to Russian President Vladimir Putin since leaving office in 2021. And then on top of that, what we heard in reference to when Ukrainian President Zelensky came to Washington, he continually said that Zelensky was the greatest salesman that the world ever knew, that he always would come to Washington with an empty hand, but then would leave with $60 billion. So, we're listening to these comments, we really got the feeling that he wasn't necessarily anti Ukraine, but he certainly wasn't pro Ukraine. And on top of that, that if we were looking at fiscal outlays in the future towards Ukraine, they were going to be far more limited than what we had seen under Biden.
John, you mentioned a secret plan there, and I know we're only a few days into Trump's second term, and he's got a lot on his plate. But are we beginning to learn a little more about it, about that secret
Well, all
plan?
right. So here is what we have discovered is that the plan itself was not even that secret. It really is really based on a plan developed by General Keith Kellogg, a former general. And the outlines are pretty much like this. Kellogg has advised the creation of a new demilitarized zone that's going to be created pretty much along the current lines of control, although both sides could negotiate what the final territory would look like. Now, this DMZ would be about 800 miles long. And we can compare this to other DMZs around the world. So, for example, the one between South Korea and North Korea, which is one of the most fortified borders in the world, is about 150, 160 miles long. So, this would be about 5 times longer and pretty difficult to defend. And defense of it would primarily fall on the British and also on the Europeans, as well as, of course, the Ukrainians. The US itself wouldn't provide any troops, but it would provide some weapons that could be purchased by Ukraine or the Europeans, as well as the potential for loans that it could offer for Ukraine. Now, Ukraine would not be allowed to join NATO, but possibly could look at some kind of defense agreements with other European powers. But then on top of that, both sides then would recognize not necessarily the lines or the territory of the others. They could still claim other territory, but they could no longer approach or try to attain that territory by way of force. And what I think Trump wanted to also say is that there are sticks and carrots involved in each of these. Of course, there's rebuilding of Ukraine, that would be a carrot. offer to the Ukrainians. And that could be done through a variety of different mechanisms. For the Russians, of course, it would be some sanctions relief. But on the stick side, it's if the Ukrainians don't agree to come to the bargaining table, the U.S. really begins to actually slow down on the amount of aid that's providing the Ukrainians. And then conversely, if for whatever reason the Kremlin doesn't want to come to the negotiating table, it then increases the amount of aid that goes to Ukraine. But as we said before, a lot of this is involving timing. Ukraine at this point is going to be need some funds over the next several months. So this is going to be a decision that he's going to have to come to a conclusion relatively quickly. And then on top of that, obviously we're going to have potentially negotiations between Trump and Putin in the next few months as well. Both sides have said they're interested in talks.
I would just add here that these bilateral agreements on defense and security between Ukraine and other European countries, there are already indications that they already started to happen. And one of the recent examples was the 100-year-old agreement on this between United Kingdom and Ukraine.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Thanks for that additional color there, Blanka. John, Trump just called for potential new tariffs or sanctions on Russia. You recently worked on a special report with our in house sanctions expert. What do we think Trump's approach will be vis a vis sanctions and tariffs against Russia?
I mean, if you look at his statements, you would think the first option really would be tariffs. So one thing that Trump has repeatedly said is he doesn't like sanctions because the more sanctions you pursue, the more likely you're going to push other countries to try to avoid use of the dollar as the reserve currency. Now, remember, the US dollar is really important for the United States because it really allows them to pay pretty cheaply for their trade and fiscal deficits. You know, in the first instance, he'd like to use tariffs against Russia, again, to push them to the negotiating table. The problem is that Russia doesn't sell much to the United States. Even before the war, it was about 3.5%. Now it's under 1%. So it's hard to imagine, aside from maybe a few sectors, maybe some commodities in either agriculture or mining, that might be affected. Otherwise, really not going to make much of a difference. Now, we could see sanctions, although we've seen quite a bit of sanctions already by the Biden administration. But there is the possibility that you could see something that the United States could do as far as increasing sanctions on Russia's shadow oil fleet. We've already seen moves in that direction. Those could be enhanced. But again, with the sanctions already existing, it's going to be difficult to really expand them to the point that they make much of a difference unless you get significant European and other ally buy in. So what he could do, obviously, is look at secondary sanctions and maybe even tariffs on individual countries that are trading with Russia. For example, on India, China, Turkey, or the United Arab Emirates. These are countries that have, purchased significant amounts of Russian energy or have really become gateways for goods to enter into Russia and are a pathway to cause some damage to the Russian economy if they can start hitting those companies that are allowing those goods to go forward.
So let's zero in now on NATO. As I mentioned in the intro, NATO expanded in 2023 to include Finland, Russia's neighbor, and again in 2024 to include the traditionally neutral Sweden. John, President Trump has already announced the U.S. withdrawal from the World Health Organization and the Paris Agreement. What about NATO?
Well, I mean, according to media reports, we do know that Trump in 2018 asked his advisors on multiple occasions as to how the United States could leave NATO and leave NATO as quickly as possible. He was upset that that NATO or Europe is really a pathway where the United States provides significant security and really doesn't get that much out of it, in his opinion. Plus, on top of that, that many of the European countries are not really even approaching 2%, although that certainly increased over time, and certainly not at the level that he's been talking about recently, which is he wants all NATO members now to be spending 5% of their GDP, even though it should be noted the United States is currently spending about 3% itself. We have this feeling that he's not necessarily so warm to NATO. And we've heard that if Europe doesn't increase its military spending, he has actually said that maybe he would let the Russians do what they want with Europe. That's according to what he said when a European leader asked him whether the United States would respect Article 5. So a lot of these things are up in the air, and you could see that there's a lot of concern inside Washington as to whether in this second administration he wants to get out of NATO. And with that in mind, it's not surprising that Congress passed a law recently, which really is supposed to prevent the president from doing just that. So you can only withdraw from NATO now, according to this legislation, if Congress passes legislation that allows the president to do it, or you get a 2/3 vote inside the Senate consenting the president to withdraw from the organization. Now, this is very legally questionable because normally the president is in control of this type of policy. But I think the key takeaway here is that you don't have to necessarily leave the organization to make a difference. So you can actually be a member of NATO. And for example, if Russia were to invade another NATO member, the response of each member of NATO is up to them. It can vary from sending in the troops and combating this aggression with your own forces, or it can be a strongly worded letter which says, I strongly disagree with what you've done and your activity in this particular location.
Okay.
In one area where I think this type of response, where it's really weak or he doesn't really respect Article 5, could really come into play is really with negotiations with Europe over Ukraine. Because we could see a situation where if the United States is pushing Ukraine to enter into an agreement and saying Europe's on the hook for all the security commitments and the weapons and everything else, and the Europeans aren't necessarily on board with all of these commitments, here's an opportunity that Trump can use to say, hey, listen, either you agree to what I put forward, or I'm just going to leave NATO altogether. I don't think he's necessarily going to do that. I don't think that's my baseline view, but it wouldn't be totally out of the question for Donald Trump to at least consider it or at least threaten it as a possibility to get the Europeans to play ball. He can actually achieve much of what he wants just by way of threatening. And I think this could be important not only vis a vis an issue with trade policy and also potentially in Ukraine, but in a variety of different features and policies in which we have disagreements between the Europeans and also the US.
Blanka, what would be Europe's or NATO's likely response to that, to the scenarios that John described there?
I think that the answer lies in defense spending and almost defense and security nationalism, if you want to call it like that, in Europe. With the war in Ukraine, the defense definitely remains a top priority for the European Union or even for the Western Europe as a whole. And in 2024, NATO members have made the largest defense spending increase of the past decade. And as John has mentioned, most of them are already meeting the 2% target. There are a couple countries that are actually surpassing percentage of the spend per GDP and are ahead of the USA. If you just look at the European NATO members, they boosted their defense budgets by average of annual 18% of last year, and that outpacing the average growth rate of around 3% that we saw prior to the war. And if you look ahead for the coming months, for this year, we estimate that further spending increases are very likely, and notably Poland and Greece, among others, have already budgeted that in their national budgets. In many other countries, however, there's not a lot of fiscal space to do this. Above all, they face large public debt levels. But that said, defense spending has been increasing, and I believe that it will continue, especially due to the current geopolitical and security situation. However, getting to that 5% magical number for many of them, this will definitely take some time and is unlikely to happen, and definitely not through the course of this year.
Some significant increases there that you mentioned. That'll be very interesting to watch. And Blanca, what are the critical factors for Russia now as the war continues?
Economic pressures, definitely. We are keeping an eye on sanctions and especially the European and then US measures to prevent sanctions avoidance. But also, if you look more on what's happening on the ground and on the war front, the morale and performance of Russian ground forces, which would include their capacity to generate, train, and equip new fresh formations, and to sustain the will to fight on, because we have seen really quite high casualty rates, especially over the past year, and only limited territorial gains in comparison.
And what about Ukraine? What are the critical factors for them at this stage, Blanka?
For Ukraine, the single critical factor is the extent to which the West, and critically the United States, will continue to meet its increasing demands, whether it is material or financial support to finance the war, including Ukrainian requests for advanced weapon systems or enabling it to engage militarily and infrastructure targets deep inside Russia, and to apply concentrations of its force that would be sufficient to break through Russian defenses, basically end what is that current stalemate.
Well, this has been a really insightful discussion. Blanka, any final thoughts for our listeners?
I'd say that 2025 is definitely going to be a pivotal year, and not just for Ukraine and Russia, but also for Europe as a whole. And this is not only related to security, but regulatory environment, trade troubles, uncertainty over the tariffs, what we can call elusive alliances that are forming across the globe and are impacting Europe, but also more localized domestic discontents. And all of this will shape what will be definitely interesting months ahead and keep Europe certainly a very interesting region to watch.
I like the references to our big themes for this year. I will drop a link to our special report on that in the description of this episode. And John, how about you? Final thoughts for our listeners?
I think that for me, obviously, 2025 is going to be a big year as well as Trump begins to implement much of his domestic and foreign policy. But it's going to be really interesting for me to see that if it's a situation where his ceasefire plan does not reach fruition, and especially if it does not do so because the Russians aren't really willing to engage, or there's a thought that they're not negotiating seriously. How does Trump really approach that? Does he really start increasing the amount of weapons that are going to Ukraine? Because not only is that kind of a bit out of character for him, but I think in some ways it's interesting because there are major divisions within his own party that are going to oppose this. So, how is he going to square that knot, especially if it's a time where he's probably not going to be able to get those votes solely from Republicans inside Congress? He's going to have to go to Democrats. It's going to be a real reversal for him. It's going to be really interesting as he maneuvers his ways through these contours to try to get his plan and make sure it gets some type of approval between all the parties involved.
All right. Well, that brings this episode of The Decisive to a close. Thank you, Blanka and John, for sharing your insights with us today. And to our listeners at home, please do follow S&P Global Market Intelligence on our social media channels, including Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram. Until next time. Thank you for listening to the Decisive podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.